Please, don't. Brianna's voice cracked as she begged, her eyes wide with terror. I swear I'll never tell anyone. Just let me go. The sound of her pleading echoed in the empty alley, desperate and full of pain. But the three men who loomed over her weren't listening. They never did. The harsh metallic scent of blood filled the air as her body trembled in the cold, unable to escape their grip. She had always been strong, but now in the face of her attackers, three officers who wore their badge like a shield against the low, she was nothing more than prey. They had taken everything from her, every last ounce of her dignity, her spirit, and now her life. By the time her boyfriend Jamal reached the place where they left her, her body was cold, lifeless. His heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as he dropped to his knees beside her. Her hands, once warm and soft, now clenched in a final, futile grasp for survival. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't speak. Rage surged through him, an uncontrollable force. The world had robbed him of everything. The woman he loved was gone, and nothing would ever fill the void she left behind. James could hear her cries in his head, echoing in the dead of night. The darkness of the world had swallowed her whole, and he was powerless. But this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The three men who had stolen her life would pay it in a way they would never forget. James would make sure of that. One by one, he would hunt them down and make them understand what it felt like to be powerless, to beg for mercy. But they wouldn't be shown any. James sat in the dimly lit kitchen, watching Brianna as she hummed to herself, effortlessly moving between the stove and the counter. The smell of their favorite dinner filled the air, a comforting reminder of how simple life used to be. Brianna's laughter rang out as she playfully threw a towel at him, teasing him for sneaking a bite of the pasta she had just prepared. It was moments like these small, intimate gestures that made him feel like everything was right in the world. She leaned in, brushing her lips against his cheek. "You're impossible," she said with a soft chuckle, her voice a melody that seemed to lift his spirits even on the worst days. James smiled, running his fingers through her hair, the warmth of her touch grounding him in the present. They didn't need grand gestures or expensive dates. These quiet moments were enough to make him feel like the luckiest man alive. They spent the evening talking about their plans for the future, plans that seemed so close, so attainable. James had always been the dreamer, but Brianna was the realist, keeping him anchored while encouraging him to chase his ambitions. They were a perfect match in every way. Her family had welcomed him with open arms when they first started dating, and he'd grown fond of the Sunday dinners at her mother's house, where laughter and stories filled the air. As they sat together on the couch that night, watching a movie, Brianna nestled her head on his shoulder, sighing contentedly. He felt her heartbeat against his chest as she closed her eyes. The world outside was quiet, peaceful. It felt like everything was in its place. James was content, thinking that this would be the life they'd share for years to come, uninterrupted, filled with love and moments like this. They had been together for over 2 years now, and in all that time, Brianna had become more than just his girlfriend. She was his partner, his best friend, the kind of person he could share his fears with, the one who always knew how to make him laugh when the world felt too heavy. They had a bond built on trust and mutual respect, something rare in a world that often made it hard to believe in. Love, it wasn't just the quiet nights they spent together. It was the way they fought for each other, how they supported one another through the challenges life threw at them. That evening, as they wrapped up their movie and turned off the lights, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He tried to push it away, blaming it on the stress of his work, but he couldn't ignore the nagging unease that had settled deep in his gut. Brianna, always the one to notice his moods, asked if he was all right. "I'm fine, babe. Just a little tired, that's all." He smiled at her, brushing the thought aside, but as she smiled back, something flickered in her eyes, a look that told him she knew more than he was letting on. She kissed him softly on the lips and whispered, "Don't worry, everything will be okay." The words stayed with him as they fell asleep, her head resting on his chest. He clung to that feeling of normalcy, the safety of her presence, as if that moment could last forever. It was a life that many people only dreamt of, a peaceful existence, grounded in the simple joys of companionship and shared moments. The love between James and Brianna was a quiet force, an unspoken understanding that gave them strength, even in the face of uncertainty. They hadn't realized it yet, but their lives, their happiness, were about to be ripped apart in the most violent way possible. The next morning started like any other. Brianna had already made breakfast when James stumbled out of bed, groggy but smiling at the sight of her. He kissed her forehead, her warm hands slipping into his as they shared a cup of coffee. It was a morning that seemed destined to be a Memory, a quiet and simple moment they would look back on when the world felt too much. But as they sat together, chatting about their plans for the day, the phone rang, interrupting the calm they'd built. Brianna picked it up, her voice cheerful as she spoke to her mum, but James could tell something shifted in her expression. She seemed to freeze, her eyes darting nervously between him and the phone. James watched her as she hung up, her hands trembling slightly. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I have to go meet someone. It's important." He could tell something was wrong. "What's going on?" "I'll be fine," she reassured him, trying to mask her anxiety. "Just something to take care of. I'll be back soon, all right?" James didn't push her further. He kissed her goodbye, not knowing it would be the last time he would ever feel the warmth of her lips against his. The last time he would feel the simplicity of their love before the storm hit. The peace they'd shared so effortlessly just hours before was gone in an instant. It was as if fate had already decided the course of their lives, and they were helpless to stop it. As he sat there alone, waiting for Brianna to return, the weight of something dark and inevitable began to settle into his chest. The life he knew was slipping away, though he didn't yet understand how or why. By the time the day ended, everything would be different. The morning after Brianna left, James couldn't shake the unease that had taken root in his chest. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. It felt like something was shifting, as though the air had changed, thick with an energy he couldn't explain. He spent the day distracted, going through the motions of his work but unable to focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to the phone call Brianna had received and the way her smile had faltered when she hung up. The memory of her nervous glance lingered in his mind, gnawing at him, fueling a sense of dread he couldn't shake. Around midday, he decided to take a walk to clear his mind. The streets were busy with the usual city noise, honking cars, the distant chatter of pedestrians, and the hum of life going on as it always did. But even amidst the ordinary, James felt like he was walking through a fog, disconnected from everything around him. As he walked, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Brianna. He opened it eagerly, but his smile faltered when he read the words, "I'm okay, just need some time, don't worry about me." It was brief, too brief, and there was a coldness to it that didn't sit right with him. He stared at the screen, trying to decipher the meaning behind the message, but it only deepened his concern. His feet carried him without thought, and before he knew it, he found himself standing in front of the local police station. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. It wasn't the place he intended to go, but something drew him here. Maybe it was the strange chill he felt from the moment he left his apartment, or perhaps it was the nagging suspicion that had been bubbling inside him. James lingered outside for a few minutes, watching as officers came and went. He had no reason to suspect anything about them until he saw the three men, the same three men. The ones Brianna had been so terrified of when she'd spoken about her work with the community. He didn't know their names, but he had seen their faces before. He had heard whispers of their brutality, how they acted with impunity, never afraid to show their racist tendencies, never worrying about the consequences because of their badges. There they were, laughing together, their faces so casually indifferent, as though their actions were normal, justified. They weren't the men who wore uniforms to protect people. They were predators, hiding behind authority. James' blood ran cold as he watched them from the corner of the street, his chest tightening in anger and disbelief. His gut told him that something was very wrong, that these men were connected to Brianna's sudden disappearance. The encounter was brief, a passing moment, but it left an indelible mark on his mind. The dread that had been building inside him grew sharper, more intense. He didn't know how or why, but something about the sight of these men felt like a premonition of disaster. As he walked away, his steps heavy with unease, he passed by a newsstand and noticed a headline in a local paper, "Police officer under investigation for corruption tied to multiple allegations." James paused, his heart skipping a beat. He scanned the article quickly, but the words blurred in his mind. The story seemed insignificant at first, another scandal in a city where corruption was far too common. But then, something caught his eye. The officer at the center of the investigation. He was one of the three men James had just seen. The article didn't name him outright, but it didn't need to. James recognized the face from the grainy police photo. His blood turned to ice. Without thinking, James made his way to Brianna's favorite coffee shop, hoping to clear his head. He needed answers, he needed to talk to her. But as he walked in, he felt an unfamiliar stillness in the air. The usual buzz of conversation and clinking cups was absent. The shop felt cold, isolated. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was Brianna's mother, James. Her voice was shaky, filled with an undercurrent of panic. "Have you heard from Brianna? She's not answering her phone, and I'm getting worried." That his heart sank. Brianna's mother had always been the calm one, the steady presence. If she was worried, he had every reason to be terrified. "I've texted her, she said she was fine. But now this isn't like her, Mrs. Turner. She wouldn't just ignore my calls." James felt the panic rising in his chest, tightening his throat. "I know," her voice cracked. "And that's why I'm calling you. Something's not right, James. She was supposed to meet me this afternoon, but she hasn't shown up. I think you need to get to the station." The words struck him like a thunderclap. The station, the same place he had just walked past, the place where he had seen those men. His stomach twisted. He had to act fast. "James, you need to find her." Her voice was pleading. "Please, I'm scared." The moment he hung up, a sense of urgency consumed him. He didn't know why, but his gut told him that Brianna was in danger, and it had something to do with the men he'd seen earlier. The pieces were falling into place now, and the picture that emerged was terrifying. It was as though the universe had been whispering warnings all along, and he had ignored them. Too blind in his own world to listen. In the back of his mind, he could almost hear Brianna's voice, the one she'd used the night before, the warning in her eyes. "Don't worry, everything will be okay." But it wasn't okay, not now, and it wouldn't be until he found her. With every step toward the station, the sense of dread only grew, a sickening, overwhelming certainty that his worst fears were about to become reality. The fate of the woman he loved hung in the balance, and all he could do was chase the shadows of the men who had taken her. James barely recognized the world around him. The grief had consumed him so completely that the noise of everyday life seemed muffled, distant. Every step he took felt heavy, like walking through quicksand, each movement dragging him deeper into a pit of despair. Brianna's absence left an unbearable void, a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The days blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and restless wandering. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in their bed. Her scent, the soft creases in the sheets where she used to lay, made his chest tighten. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison, every corner haunted by memories of her. Her laughter echoed in his mind, the sound of her voice asking about his day, the way her eyes would light up when she spoke about the future, his future, their future. It all seemed so far away now, as if it belonged to someone else. Each morning, James would wake up with a sense of numbness. His body moved on autopilot, but his mind never truly left the dark place it had fallen into. He went through the motions, eating, showering, going to work, but it all felt meaningless. The world moved on around him, oblivious to his pain. People smiled at him in passing, but he couldn't bring himself to smile back. They didn't understand. No one understood the depths of the sorrow that had taken root inside him. It wasn't just grief that ate at him, there was an overwhelming sense of guilt, like he had failed her. She had warned him, hadn't she? That night, before she left, something in her eyes told him she was scared, but he hadn't listened. He had brushed it off, told her everything would be fine, but it wasn't fine. He wasn't fine. His mind spiraled. What if he had known? What if he had done something? Could he have stopped it? The what-ifs clawed at his consciousness, relentless and suffocating. He could feel them creeping in, tearing at the fragile walls he had built around himself. He had promised her that he would protect her, and yet, when it mattered most, he wasn't there. James hadn't been able to go to the police. Every time he thought about it, his stomach churned. They were supposed to protect people like her, but the men responsible for her death wore badges, 3 men whose faces still haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their cold, indifferent stares. They were untouchable, and that made the reality of her death even harder to accept. It wasn't just the murder, it was the way the system had failed her, the way it failed so many others like her. Brianna wasn't just a statistic, she was a person with dreams, with a life full of potential, and they had stolen it from her. He'd had moments, brief fleeting moments, when his anger had fled. His fists would clench, his teeth would grind, but each time, it felt like it wasn't enough. He couldn't get close to the men who had done this to her. They were protected by the system, shielded by their uniforms, and the more he thought about it, the more helpless he felt. The anger wasn't a solution, it was just a constant, simmering undercurrent, threatening to swallow him whole. The pain would have been unbearable if not for the moments of fleeting peace, moments when he would remember her laugh or feel the warmth of her touch. They were rare and precious, but they were enough to keep him grounded in the chaos until the memories weren't enough anymore. James couldn't keep pretending that he was just going to let it go. He couldn't keep waiting for someone else to make things right. The world didn't care about people like Brianna. and it certainly didn't care about him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the only way to make the pain stop was to do something. But what could he do? The answer had become clearer as the days passed. He had to make them pay. The three men, those monsters who had stolen Brianna from him, they had to be held accountable. He couldn't rely on a broken system that had turned a blind eye to her suffering. He had tried to bury it, to ignore the gnawing need for revenge that was taking root inside him, but it had been impossible. The anger had taken on a life of its own, pushing him forward, dragging him toward a path he wasn't sure he could turn back from. But even as he thought about it, even as the plan began to form in his mind, he couldn't escape the unease that settled in his gut. Was this what she would have wanted? Would she want him to become like them? The question weighed heavily on him. Brianna had always been the voice of reason, the one who grounded him when he got lost in his own head. She had believed in justice, but not vengeance. Could he honor her memory if he became the very thing he hated, the very thing that had taken her life? There were nights when the doubt would creep in, quiet and insidious. His resolve would waver, and he would wonder if there was another way he could find peace without losing himself. But each time he thought about it, the face of the men who had taken her life would fill his vision. Each time he thought about it, he saw Brianna lying lifeless, taken in the most brutal way imaginable. The pain, the guilt, the anger, they all swirled together, becoming a storm he couldn't control. And in that storm, revenge became his only anchor. He didn't know if it would give him the peace he so desperately needed, but he knew he had to try. One night, as he sat alone in their apartment, the weight of everything pressing on him, he made a choice. He would do it. He would make them pay, not just for Brianna, but for everyone they had hurt. He didn't know how yet, but he would figure it out. And when the time came, he would be ready. For now, though, all he had was his grief, his pain, and a burning desire to make them feel what he had felt, to make them know, as he knew, that they had taken something precious, and he wasn't going to stop until they paid for it. James' desire for vengeance became clearer each day. But before he could carry out his plan, he had to understand who he was up against. It wasn't just the faces of the three men who had taken Brianna from him that haunted his thoughts, it was their power, their place within a system that shielded them from accountability. To defeat them, he had to understand them. The three men were police officers who had sworn to protect and serve, but who had instead used their authority to dominate and destroy. They moved through the world with the unshakable confidence that came with wearing a badge, an unspoken shield that allowed them to bend the rules without fear of reprisal. To them, the law wasn't about fairness, it was a tool to wield for their own advantage. The first was Officer Darren Cook. He was the one who had seemed the most detached from the scene of Brianna's death, the one who had stood apart, watching as the others brutalized her. He had an air of cold indifference about him, a man who had long abandoned any belief in justice. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes that had seen too much of the ugliness in the world. His uniform was always immaculate, a stark contrast to the filth of his soul. Cook's backstory wasn't one of tragedy, but of privilege gone unchecked. He had been born into a wealthy family in a predominantly white neighborhood, a place where the color of a person's skin mattered more than their character. He had joined the police force straight out of college, hoping to follow in the footsteps of his father, a well-respected officer in the same department. His career had been smooth, no controversies, no complaints. He was promoted quickly, praised for his discipline and ability to maintain control in volatile situations. But as his career progressed, so did his deep-seated biases. He had come to view his job as more about power than protection. People of color were simply targets in his eyes, just another problem to manage. It didn't matter how they were treated, how much they suffered, he was untouchable, protected by his status in the department and his family's influence. Then there was Officer Mark Riggins, the second of the trio. Riggins was a man driven by personal demons, someone who couldn't escape the shadows of his past. His temper was volatile, his actions impulsive. He wasn't as calculated as Cook, but he was equally dangerous in his own way. Riggins had grown up in a poor, crime-ridden neighborhood, surrounded by violence and poverty. His father had been an abusive alcoholic who had frequently taken out his frustrations on Mark and his siblings. Mark had joined the police force with the naive belief that he could make a difference, but quickly discovered that the system was not built for justice, it was built for control. His temper had cost him relationships, promotions, and respect within the department, but his anger had become a defining trait. He lashed out at those he considered weak, and his racism was not born from a belief in superiority but from deep-rooted insecurity and bitterness. He viewed people of color, as a reminder of the life he had tried to escape but could never truly outrun. His violence was a mask for his own self-loathing, a way to regain control in a life where he had felt powerless for so long. And then there was Officer Tom Harris, the third man in the group, who seemed to be the least affected by the weight of their actions, yet the most unpredictable. Harris was the quiet one, the one who didn't speak much but whose eyes burned with a quiet rage. He had been a decorated officer in the force, praised for his sharp instincts and his ability to de-escalate situations. But beneath the surface, Harris was haunted by a history that made him deeply distrustful of anyone who didn't look like him. He had served in the military before joining the force, and his experiences in combat had left him scarred, both physically and mentally. He had seen horrors that no person should have to endure, and it had twisted something inside him. He was a man who had been broken by the world and was now looking for a way to break others before they could break him. Harris had joined the police force with the intention of finding structure, of carving out a place where he could belong after the chaos of war, but the job, instead of healing him, had only exacerbated his anger. His racism was not just an unconscious bias, it was a survival mechanism. He viewed the world as a battlefield, and everyone was either an ally or an enemy. People of color, especially black people, were enemies in his eyes, symbols of a threat he couldn't fully comprehend. In his mind, they were the cause of the chaos, the disorder, and the violence that had scarred him. He didn't see them as people, he saw them as obstacles that had to be removed. Together, the three men made a dangerous trio, each motivated by different things, but united by a shared sense of superiority and entitlement. They had built their lives around the idea that the world owed them something, that they deserved power, respect, and control. They used their badges as tools to enforce their own warped sense of justice, trampling on anyone who stood in their way. James had learned this about them through whispers in the department, through the rumors that had started to swirl after Brianna's death. He hadn't yet gathered the courage to confront them, but he knew everything he needed to. He knew how they operated, how they had worked together to cover their tracks, how they had made sure to leave no evidence, no fingerprints, no trace of their involvement. But James wasn't stupid. He knew that the truth would come out, one way or another, and when it did, it would be too late for them to hide behind their badges. What disturbed him the most was how unaffected they seemed. They walked through the world like they owned it, each of them protected by the walls of the system they had built their careers within. There was no guilt in their eyes, no remorse for the life they had taken. Brianna had been nothing more than collateral damage in their twisted view of the world. As James thought about them, he could feel his own resolve growing stronger. He couldn't leave it up to anyone else. No one else would make them pay. No one else could feel the pain he felt, the pain of losing the person who had meant everything. Brianna had been innocent, and they had taken her life without a second thought, but James would make them understand what it felt like to lose everything. In the darkest corner of his mind, he could already hear their pleas for mercy, but he would offer them none. The same way they had shown no mercy to Brianna, he would show them none. He would make them pay, one by one. James spent the next few days in a haze, a silent storm brewing inside him. He had gathered the pieces, he had learned everything he could about the three men who had taken Brianna from him. He knew their habits, their routines, their weaknesses. The more he learned, the more he realized that he was no longer just thinking about justice. He was thinking about revenge. The plan was simple in its brutality. One by one he would hunt them down. There was no room for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. Each one of them deserved to pay for what they had done. Brianna deserved to have her justice. He could feel the weight of the gun in his hand, a cold promise that, once set in motion, couldn't be undone. But even as the plan took shape, James found himself torn. The questions that had plagued him before Brianna's death now pressed harder. Was this truly what she would have wanted? She had always been the calm one, the voice of reason in his life. She had fought for equality, for justice, not vengeance. Could he live with himself if he became the very thing that had taken her from him? He sat alone in their apartment one night, staring out the window. The city lights flickered below, offering no comfort, no sense of peace. Brianna had always loved the view from their living room. She had called it her quiet place, but for him, it was nothing but a reminder of what he had lost. He tried to think back to the last time they had been together, how full of life she had been, how happy. They had planned so many things together, things they would never get to do. The ache in his chest deepened. Would she forgive me? He thought of the woman he had loved so fiercely, the woman who had trusted him to keep her safe. Could he really walk this path, knowing that he might lose the one thing that had kept him grounded? For the first time, James felt a deep gnawing Fear of becoming something he couldn't come back from. Fear that, in the pursuit of revenge, he would lose himself entirely. The internal battle raged inside him, but the anger he felt toward the officers kept pushing him forward. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Brianna's lifeless body. He saw the faces of those three men, their cold, unfeeling gazes as they had taken everything from him. There was no justice in the world, no one else to turn to. The system that was supposed to protect people like Brianna had failed her, and now it was up to him to make sure those men didn't escape without consequences. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. He looked down at the screen, a message from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. You know what you need to do. It's the only way. James felt a chill crawl up his spine. His hand tightened around the phone, but his mind couldn't fully grasp the message. Who is this? He wondered. But as the words sank in, something inside him shifted. The fear, the doubt, it all melted away. There was no more hesitation. The path was clear. He stood up, the determination settling over him like a cloak. He had to act quickly. He had spent too long in limbo, too long questioning his every move. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was his only choice. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for Brianna, for every life those men had destroyed, for every person they had hurt. He would make them pay. James spent the next few days carefully planning, stalking each of the three men, learning their routines. Officer Cook, with his pristine uniform and polished demeanor, spent his days at the precinct, often staying late into the night, put himself an easy target. Officer Riggins, the volatile one, spent his time at local bars, his rage simmering beneath the surface as he drank away his frustrations. Officer Harris was the hardest to track, but James knew that every man had a weakness. Harris liked to spend his weekends hunting in the woods, escaping the pressures of his job. Each of them had a place where they felt safe, where they thought they were untouchable. James knew he would have to strike when they least expected it, when they let their guard down. His first target would be Cook, the calm, methodical one, the man who thought he could get away with anything. But as the time for action drew near, James found himself standing at the edge of a precipice, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. He had no illusions about what he was becoming. He was crossing a line, one that once crossed, couldn't be undone. He would no longer be the man Brianna had loved. He would be someone else, someone who had taken a life, someone who had become part of the very system he had once despised. But there was no turning back. The darkness that had taken root inside him couldn't be ignored. It consumed him, driving him toward the only thing that seemed to offer any kind of release/revenge. He had made the decision. The first shot would be fired soon, and it would set off a chain of events that could never be stopped. Each death would bring him closer to the peace he so desperately sought, but each one would also take him further away from the man he had once been, the man who had dreamed of a future with Brianna. The phone buzzed again. Another message. This time it was a location: Cook's apartment. James knew this was it. The time had come. As he prepared for the night ahead, the weight of his choices pressed down on him, but there was a strange clarity now. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could make them pay for their actions. He would hunt them down, one by one, and in the end, when it was all over, maybe then, just maybe, he would finally feel the weight of Brianna's loss lift. But deep inside, he knew that whatever peace he might find, it would never bring her back, and the man who walked away from this would be forever changed. The moment James made the decision to act, it was as though a switch had been flipped inside him. His sense of purpose, his focus, hardened into a singular, relentless drive. Each move he made was calculated, precise. He would bring those men down, no matter what it took. But as he moved forward with his plan, something else began to shift in the shadows, a resistance that he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the men he was hunting who stood in his way. It was the entire system, a machine designed to protect its own, to shield those who were meant to serve and protect, but had instead become the perpetrators of violence and oppression. The first sign that his pursuit would not be as simple as he had imagined came when he tried to access the case files at the police department. The walls of bureaucracy, of red tape, seemed to grow taller every time he tried to get closer to the truth. He had started gathering evidence, the little pieces that might expose the corruption that had allowed the three officers to go unchecked. But as soon as he tried to move forward, he was met with resistance. Small, subtle barriers. That made it clear his actions were being monitored. It started with a phone call he received one evening. A number he didn't recognize flashing on his screen. When he answered, the voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. "James," it said, the tone thick with warning. You're playing a dangerous game. You need to stop, now. His blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the voice, but the message was clear. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone was watching him. First, he thought it might have been a threat from the department, perhaps someone from the inside trying to protect the officers, trying to silence him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the resistance wasn't just coming from the system, it was coming from people he cared about. People who, despite the way the officers had stolen Brianna's life, didn't believe in his quest for revenge, that it was his mother who first tried to intervene. She had always been a rock for him, the one person who had never doubted his choices. But when she found out what he was planning, her disappointment was written across her face. You don't have to do this, she said one afternoon when he came over to visit, his face drawn with exhaustion. She had always been the gentle, nurturing type, a woman who believed in forgiveness, in redemption. But there was a sadness in her eyes now, something she hadn't shared with him before. This isn't the way, James. It won't bring her back. It will only destroy you. Her words cut through him like a blade. He could hear her, could feel the weight of her concern for him, but something inside him was too far gone to listen. Brianna had been taken from him in the most brutal way imaginable. How could he possibly turn his back on the need to make them pay? I don't care what it costs, he said, his voice cold, a sharp contrast to the man he used to be. They need to suffer. They need to know what it feels like to lose someone they love. To lose everything. His mother's face crumpled. With pain, you're better than this, James. Don't let them win. You're not like them. But he wasn't sure anymore. He wasn't sure who he was. The man he had been, the man who had loved Brianna and lived for the future they had planned together, was slipping away. In his place stood a man driven by anger, by vengeance, by the need to make them pay for the emptiness they had left in his life. It was too late to stop now. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. His mother's voice trembled as she pleaded with him, but it was no use. James, she whispered, tears in her eyes. Please, don't become one of them. That night, he couldn't sleep. Her words kept repeating in his mind, like a broken record. Don't become one of them. But wasn't he already? He had promised Brianna that he would protect her, and he had failed. Now, he was becoming something he despised in his quest to avenge her. He could feel the weight of that realization pressing on him, but it only made his resolve stronger. He was already lost. He had already crossed the line. The only way to fix it was to finish what he had started. As James continued with his plan, the pressure mounted. It wasn't just his mother. His friends started pulling away, too. They didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen what he had seen, hadn't felt the emptiness that had taken over his life. They weren't living with the constant ache of knowing Brianna was gone, knowing her life had been taken by men who would likely never face any real consequences. It was his best friend, Marcus, who finally confronted him directly. Marcus had always been the level-headed one, the voice of reason in their group. But now, standing in front of James, his face was filled with concern. You're going down a path you can't come back from. Man, Marcus said, his voice low, trying to break through to him. This is the kind of shit that destroys people. You think you're going to find peace by taking their lives? You won't. You'll just end up losing more of yourself. James wanted to shout, to tell him that he didn't understand, that no one understood, but he couldn't. The words stuck in his throat, lodged there by the raw emotion that had been building for so long. He looked at Marcus and felt a pang of guilt. Marcus had always been there for him, and now, he was trying to pull him back from the edge. But James wasn't sure if he even wanted to come back. They deserve it, Marcus, he said, his voice a whisper, almost too soft for him to recognize. They took her from me. I have to do this. Marcus shook his head, his face filled with pity. And what about you, huh? What happens to you when this is all over? What's left of you? James didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was, he didn't know. But he couldn't stop now. Not after everything that had happened. Not after Brianna's death. The pressure grew as James moved forward with his plan, the internal resistance, the voices of his friends and family warning him, urging him to let go, only made his resolve stronger. The world he had known, the life he had shared with Brianna, seemed like a distant memory now, something he could never return to. He had to finish this. He had to make them pay. But even as the plan began to unfold, the system itself fought back in ways he hadn't anticipated. The more he dug, the more he realized how deeply the corruption ran. The officers were untouchable, their actions shielded by the same system that was supposed to protect the public. The department was already covering its tracks, erasing evidence, making sure that nothing could be traced back to them. James felt like he was fighting an enemy He couldn't see like the walls were closing in on him from all sides. Every step he took, every move he made, seemed to be countered by the weight of the system. The people he had trusted, the ones who had claimed to seek justice, were the very ones who protected his enemies, and with every piece of the puzzle he uncovered, the more he realized just how deep the conspiracy went. The world had become a maze, and he was running out of time. As the tension mounted, James had to ask himself, would he continue down this path of vengeance, despite the overwhelming resistance from all sides? Would he let the same system that had allowed Brianna's killers to walk free in? Or would he find a way to tear it all down, piece by piece, until it could no longer protect those who had wronged him? The clock was ticking, and every choice he made felt like it might be his last. The night James had been waiting for had finally arrived. His heart hammered in his chest, a constant reminder of the fear and the rage that had consumed him for so long. He stood outside the apartment building, staring up at the balcony where Officer Darren Cook had settled for the night. It was a cold, unforgiving night, the kind where everything felt sharp, every breath a reminder of the tension in the air. He had spent weeks planning, gathering the evidence, mapping out the moves. Tonight, it would end. Tonight, Cook would pay for what he had done. The stillness of the city contrasted sharply with the storm inside of him. He had already confronted the consequences of his actions mentally, questioning whether he was any different from the men he sought to destroy. And yet, the thought that had driven him to prevent justice overpowered the voice of doubt that tried to warn him of the cost. Tonight it would be one step closer to what he had promised himself to make Cook pay. He would end this nightmare that had stolen everything from him. Brianna would not have died in vain, but as he climbed the stairwell to the floor where Cook's apartment lay, he couldn't ignore the tremor of unease that crawled through his bones. He was no longer the man he had been. He had become someone else entirely. His hand tightened around the handle of the gun. The weight of it was comforting and terrifying all at once. He knew he had crossed a line, one he could never uncross. But in that moment, he didn't care. He had a purpose now, something to anchor him in the chaos of his mind. James paused outside Cook's door. His pulse thudded in his ears as he listened, waiting for any sound that might give away Cook's position. The apartment was silent. Cook was alone. He had made sure of it. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open. A surge of adrenaline hitting his bloodstream as the darkened interior of the apartment greeted him. He moved silently, each step calculated, rehearsed. He'd done this countless times in his mind. Tonight, he would get the justice Brianna deserved. He found Cook sitting on the couch, his back to the door. The television flickered on, the light casting a dim glow over his face. Cook hadn't heard him yet. James took a step forward, then another. Each breath he took felt louder than the last. And then, just as he reached the threshold of the living room, Cook spoke without turning around. "I knew you were coming." James froze. The calmness in Cook's voice sent a chill down his spine. The officer didn't sound scared, didn't sound like a man who feared for his life. He sounded bored. Cook's voice was as cold as the air between them. "You've been planning this for weeks, haven't you?" He turned slowly, his eyes locking with James's, and James saw it then, the complete absence of fear, the coldness that matched his own. "Why?" James heard himself ask, the question spilling out before he could stop it. "Why did you do it? What did she ever do to you?" Cook didn't flinch. He leaned back, as if reclining in a chair, fully relaxed, as if this confrontation were nothing more than an inconvenience. "She was nothing to me. She was just a means to an end. You think I care about her? I don't care about people like her. Hell, I don't care about anyone but myself." The words hit James like a punch to the gut, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Cook had just exposed the rot at the core of everything. He had been right all along. The system wasn't just broken. It was designed to protect people like Cook. His indifference, his disregard for human life, was a reflection of the system that had allowed him to continue hurting others, unchallenged, for years. "But you didn't have to kill her." James's voice trembled as he spoke, as if the weight of his words was suffocating him. "She was a person. She didn't deserve this." Cook finally stood up, taking slow, deliberate steps toward James. The nonchalance in his movements made James's anger surge again, the heat of it filling his chest. "She didn't matter to me," Cook said, his voice dripping with disdain. "She wasn't even worth the trouble we had to go through. But you've been a real pain, haven't you, coming after me, following me now? You think you can make me feel something? You think you can make me pay for what I've done?" James's grip on the gun tightened. He felt the anger rise in him, a flood of emotion threatening to overtake him. His body was shaking now, his breath coming faster. The gun trembled in his hand. its cold steel a reminder of the power he held. But as he stared at Cook's smirking face, he was struck by a terrible realization. In that moment, as the room pulsed with tension, he couldn't help but see himself in Cook. His obsession with vengeance, his blind rigid was beginning to turn him into what he hated. The thought made him recoil, but it was too late. Cook saw the hesitation in James's eyes, the flicker of doubt, and he grinned wider. You can't do it, can you? You're just like me. You pretend you're different, but you're not. You'll become a part of this. You'll become a monster. Just like me. The words hit home harder than James wanted to admit. He had spent so long seeing Cook as the enemy, as the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in his life. But now he saw the reflection of his own darkness. The pain that had driven him to this moment, the rage that had consumed him, was beginning to twist him into something unrecognizable, wasn't he? In some way already a part of the same system Cook represented. James raised the gun, his body shaking violently as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. His finger hovered over the trigger, but the moment felt suspended in time. His eyes locked with Cook's, those cold, soulless eyes, and in that moment he saw his own pain mirrored back at him. The man who had taken Brianna's life was nothing more than a reflection of the monster he had been becoming. In a final, agonizing moment of clarity, James realized something: revenge would never give him the closure he sought. It wouldn't bring Brianna back. It wouldn't erase the pain that had consumed him. It would only destroy him further. Cook laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that filled the room. You're weak. You'll never make it. James felt his hand tremble, and in that instant, he made a choice. He lowered the gun. The weight of the decision felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on his chest. He couldn't kill Cook, not like this. Not with the same cold, detached brutality that Cook had used to take Brianna's life. He turned away, stepping back toward the door. His heart was pounding in his chest, and every step felt like it was taking him further from the man he had been. But it was the only way forward. He couldn't become like Cook. He couldn't let vengeance consume him. I'm done, James whispered, the words almost lost in the silence. You're not worth it. And with that, he walked out of the apartment, leaving Cook standing in the darkness, the echoes of their confrontation lingering in the air. As James stepped into the cold night, he knew the fight wasn't over. But in that moment he had made a choice. He wouldn't be the monster. He wouldn't let revenge be his undoing. The consequences of his actions would follow him. But for the first time in weeks he felt the tiniest spark of something that might resemble peace. James sat in the quiet apartment, the sound of his own breath the only noise that seemed to fill the space. It had been over a week since he made the choice not to kill Darren Cook. Over a week since he walked away from the final confrontation, choosing to spare the man who had destroyed everything he once loved. But even though he had made that decision, the darkness still loomed over him. The weight of the past few weeks, the bloodshed, the vengeance, it all clung to him, wrapping itself around his soul like a vice, suffocating him slowly. The faces of the 3 officers, the ones who had taken Brianna from him, haunted him in his every waking moment. He had killed them, one by one, each death a step closer to the justice he had believed would bring him peace. But now, sitting here, surrounded by the silence of an empty apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something much more important than the men who had wronged him. In his pursuit of revenge, he had lost a part of himself that he would never get back. Each death had felt justified in the moment, each one had been an act of retribution, of righteous anger. But now, in the aftermath, all James could feel was emptiness. The victory he had anticipated didn't bring him closure. It didn't bring him peace. It didn't bring Brianna back. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of the guilt pressing down on him harder with each passing day. Was this what she would have wanted? He thought, staring at the framed photograph of Brianna on the table beside him. Her smile was radiant, a reminder of the woman he had once loved and the life they had dreamed of sharing. He had promised her he would protect her, that he would keep her safe from harm. But in the end, it wasn't protection he had given her. It was vengeance. And now that vengeance had consumed him, had hollowed him out from the inside, he stood up and moved toward the window, his eyes focusing on the city below. But he didn't see anything. His mind was far away, replaying the scenes of the past few weeks like a film that refused to stop. The confrontation with Cook had been the turning point, the moment when everything had changed. At that moment of clarity, the decision to spare Cook's life hadn't brought him peace. Instead, it had left him feeling more lost than ever. He had thought that ending their lives would somehow bring him justice, but it hadn't. It hadn't brought him anything. He was still angry, was still broken, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that would never be the same. James The soft voice of his mother interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway. She had been the one to warn him, the one to tell him not to go down this path. Now she was here, in his apartment, the same concern etched on her face that had been there since the day he told her what he had planned. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room before landing on him. She didn't need to ask if he was okay. The look on his face said it all. "I did it," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "I killed them all." His mother walked toward him, her expression soft but filled with sorrow. "And how do you feel now, James?" she asked gently. The question hit him like a punch to the gut. How did he feel? He wasn't sure he knew anymore. "I thought it would bring me peace," he whispered. "I thought it would make the pain go away, but it hasn't. Only made it worse. I don't feel better. I feel empty." His mother's hand reached out, gently resting on his shoulder. "Revenge doesn't heal you, sweetheart. It only destroys what's left of you. It eats at your soul, until there's nothing but darkness." James closed his eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. He had been so sure of his path, so certain that by taking their lives, he would finally find some semblance of closure. But he had been wrong. The weight of his actions was too heavy to bear. The faces of the men he had killed, each one now a ghost, in his mind, him of the person he had become. He wasn't the man Brianna had known. He wasn't the man he had once been. He had become something else entirely, a man consumed by rage, a man who had let vengeance define him. "I thought I was doing it for her," James continued, his voice shaking. "But I've destroyed everything I was supposed to protect. I've destroyed myself." His mother's grip tightened on his shoulder, her voice steady and full of compassion. "No, James, you're not lost. You can still find your way back. It's never too late to choose the right path. You can choose to heal, to move forward. But it won't happen until you forgive yourself. You need to let go of the darkness." The words felt like a bomb to the wound inside him, but they also felt impossible to believe. How could he forgive himself for what he had done? How could he ever find redemption after everything he had taken from the world? "I don't know how," James whispered. "I don't know how to live with this." "You don't have to do it alone," his mother said softly, pulling him into a tight hug. "You have me. You have your family. We'll help you. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." For a long moment, James stood there in his mother's arms, feeling the weight of the world begin to lift, just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a beginning. Later that evening, James found himself walking to Brianna's grave. He had avoided it for weeks, too afraid to face the finality of her death, too afraid to confront the truth that she was gone. But tonight, he had to go. He had to apologize. He had to find a way to say goodbye. As he stood there, the soft evening breeze rustling the leaves around him, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Brianna's grave was simple, a small headstone with her name etched in stone. He knelt down, his heart heavy with grief. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Brianna. I thought I could make it right, but I was wrong. I've lost myself in the process. I've destroyed everything. And now, I don't know if I'll ever find my way back." For the first time since her death, James felt the tears come. He let them fall, one by one, as he wept for the life he had lost, for the woman he had loved, and for the man he had become. As the sun set behind him, the world around him seemed to shift, just slightly. There was no grand epiphany, no sudden rush of peace. But in that moment, James understood something crucial. Vengeance had never been the answer. The justice he had sought had only led him further into darkness. And the only way to heal, to move forward, was to let go of the hatred that had consumed him. He stood up, wiping his eyes, and took a deep breath. The journey ahead would be long, it would be hard. But for the first time he felt a small spark of hope that, despite everything he had lost, he could find a way to live again. The road to redemption would not be easy, but it was a road he had to walk, for Brianna, for himself, and for the future he had almost destroyed. The battle wasn't over, but it was no longer about vengeance. It was about healing, and that was a fight he was ready to face.